Bureaucracy as regulators. The definition. Regulation means to use government authority to control or change some practice in the private sector. The private sector is businesses and individuals. Now, there's a couple of ways that the bureaucracy works as a regulator. Now, the problem with bureaucracy as a regulator is that a lot of times the people that are working for the bureaucracy used to work for the private sector that they are now regulating. So that would be like me working on Wall Street and then going to work in the Security and Exchange Commission, which monitors the financial activities of Wall Street investments. So there's a conflict of interest, or there's a little bit of bias, because if I'm working for a group that is responsible for regulating who I used to work for, I might not want to regulate them as strictly as I maybe should. Okay, let's see. But economics and everyday life, um, the daily lives of people and companies um, are always monitored or regulated or overseen by the federal government. We are a mixed economy. We do not have a free enterprise economy. In every situation and everything you do, the federal government has some rules or regulations behind it. From the cars that you drive, the government regulates that. To the clothes you wear, that's regulated by the government. By the media that you listen to, that's regulated by the government. So it pervades your life. But let's take the car industry, the automobile industry. The Security and Exchange Commission regulates the buying and selling of Ford, GM, Chrysler stocks. The National Labor Regulation Board regulates the relationship between the labor unions and the managers and the owners of the company. The Department of Labor mandates affirmative action, hiring workers, and promoting minorities. The EPA and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration regulates the car's pollution control, their energy saving, and safety standards. The FTC regulates the Federal Trade Commission regulates unfair advertising and deceptive consumer practices. There is every single aspect of your car is regulated somehow in some way by the federal government. How it grew? In 1877, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, there was no government regulation. The Supreme Court at that point upheld the right of the government to regulate the business operations of a particular Chicago warehouse in Munn versus Illinois. Okay, so that's MUNN versus Illinois. In that Supreme Court case, Supreme Court said that Congress could create the first regulatory commission we have ever had, or the first government rule enforcement agency, and that was the ICC, the International Commission, or the International Commerce Commission. All right, so, oh no, that didn't work. Ugh. Well, it's not gonna work. So let me get it. Sorry about that. I was gonna write ICC and Munn versus Illinois up there, but the drawing tool defaults to some weird thing. So we're just gonna have to remember that, write it down. Okay, how regulation works. Congress grants the agency power with hopefully detailed goals. Then the agency is going to inspect businesses. The agency must enforce rules through its own procedures, and if they catch a business not following the rules, they can fine the business. Um, Sometimes they have to wait for complaints to come into their department and then handle it, but basically, Congress writes a law that's a rule against a particular private sector industry, and then the agency goes out and inspects it. So let's go with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It is the job of the EPA to go and make sure that chemical plants aren't illegally dumping chemicals or wastewater into rivers, which would then get into our water source and make us sick. So the EPA has to, they go and inspect businesses, and if a business is in violation, the EPA fines them. Now, you all have seen since the 1980s a push for deregulation. Deregulation is lifting restrictions on businesses and industries for which government rules had been established. Now, in the 1980s, the right or Republicans pushed for deregulation. And the reason they pushed for deregulation is because they saw a lot of problems with regulation. It raises prices. It's expensive for businesses to follow all of these rules. So a business has a rule that they have to pay a worker minimum wage. That costs the money, that costs the business their profit margin. Right? Or if a business has to put, or if a car company has to put side airbags, side window airbags in your car, that now costs the company more money. That is then going to make our products more expensive. That rolls into hurting competitiveness on a global scale. Other nations, especially China, have fewer regulations on pollution and worker safety. Thus, American products may cost more in comparison to those products that are made abroad in countries by companies that don't have to follow all of those rules, so it's cheaper. Okay. Congressional control of the bureaucracy. There's a couple of things that Congress can do if they don't like the way an agency is operating. They have control over appointment. So let's say that Congress doesn't like how the Department of Transportation is handling their job. When Secretary of Transportation comes available or vacant, Congress can make sure that the person who gets that job is somebody that they agree with. Congress has control of giving an agency money. They hold hearings. Hearings in the how a bill becomes a law process. So when they're writing laws, they're going to hear from agencies about whether or not agencies like what's about the law that they're going to have to enforce. Or they're going to hear from interest groups about how agencies are doing in enforcing law. Okay. They hold oversight and investigative committee meetings. So that's when an oversight, you're monitoring how they're doing something. So you can have the Secretary of Agriculture come in and ask them, hey, what's up with all of that Monsanto business? Why are y'all so cuddly with each other? Why don't we talk about how you can make sure that you're enforcing rules on them? Or you can do oversight. Like if something goes wrong, or investigation, I'm sorry. If something goes wrong, you subpoena a head of an agency and you have them answer questions about why something went awry. They can also rewrite legislation. So if the agencies have had a lot of administrative discretion and they've kind of gotten a little bit too powerful, Congress can rewrite a piece of legislation to rein in the power of the agency. And sunset legislation. If Congress is afraid that agencies might not know how to implement something well, they'll put an expiration date on the law, and then after, say, 4 years of carrying the law out, they can look to see and evaluate how well that regulation or that law was carried out, and if they don't like it, then they can just let the law expire. The president, obviously the president appoints, so he's going to appoint people that he likes. He can issue executive orders, and those executive orders will then have to be followed by an agency. So if Obama were to issue an executive order right now to the Department of Defense, which he did actually, he issued an executive order to the Department of Defense to not enforce don't ask, don't tell, where the homosexual serving in the military, if he issues that executive order, then the agency has to do that. Impound funds, he could take away the money that was given to an agency by Congress. Of course, that's been limited since the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974. Along with the OMB, he can alter their budget, and he can reorganize an agency. If he doesn't like the way that an agency is operating, he can incorporate it into another agency. Like, we used to have a War Department, or a Department of War. We reorganized that into a Department of Defense. Okay, iron triangles. Remember the three components that make up an iron triangle: congressional committees, agencies, and interest groups. Oh, let me go back to that. Okay, agencies are going to be more likely to ask an interest group or an industry for help when pressuring Congress to give the agency more money. Interest groups want agencies to regulate loosely and not really hold the private sector to a lot of rules and regulations. We're going to go over this in class a lot. And iron triangle, you can look at some iron triangle images on Google Images, but like I said, we're going to be working on it in class. Okay. Reforming the bureaucracy. So, like I started off, is that there's a lot of issues that people have with bureaucracy. They think it's a lot of red tape, that there's a lot of issues with them, that it costs too much money for us to have all of these groups. So the problems: red tape, conflict amongst agencies, like the Department of Transportation may not agree with the Department of Interior. They might want to build a highway right through Yellowstone. That's no good. There's duplication of responsibility, meaning that there's a bunch of different agencies that have the same jobs, and that there's a lot of waste. So how are you gonna reform? Well, it's hard to get rid of the red tape because you have to follow all of the rules. So that makes it hard to reform. It makes it hard to reform because Congress really can't prioritize. Congress, again, I said it a couple of videos back, but Congress really likes to have control over a bunch of different agencies. So they don't really want to show favorites for one or the other. Like the Department of Agriculture is going to be closely linked to the Committee on Agriculture. The Committee on Agriculture doesn't want to get rid of an agency because they don't want to lose that control that they have over it. And then again, reform is difficult. The National Performance Review, we come up with a report on how agencies are working and how well they work. Of course, who reads it? I don't even read it, and that tells you something. And the last thing is privatization. We could privatize or have private companies do a lot of the work that we have the federal government do. The pro to that is that sometimes private companies can do something for cheaper. Like, we can contract a company to provide road building, or we can contract a private company to pick up or to clean up rivers instead of the federal government doing it. So they can probably do it cheaper. The con is that a private company is worried about profit. The government is worried about the public good. So there's not always that motivation in a private company to do what's right for the American people, whereas the government is supposed to be more worried about the American people. Okay, that is it.